The candle in Eleanor's hand shook so hard that wax dripped onto her fingers, but she did not feel the burn. She only felt the cold fury pouring out of the man standing before her in the grand hallway of Kensworth House. "Leave my house forever," Julian Ashford said, his voice low and hard as stone. Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard. Only that morning he had kissed her forehead before leaving for London and promised to return before supper. Now his eyes looked at her as though she were a stranger who had broken into his home. "Julian, please," she whispered. "Tell me what has happened. What have I done?" He held up a folded letter, its edges crushed from being gripped too tightly. "Do not pretend innocence with me. I have read every word. I know what you have done, and with whom." Eleanor reached for the letter, but he pulled it away as though her touch might poison it further. "I have written no such letter," she said. "I do not know what lies within it, but I swear to you on my life, I have been faithful to you every single day since we married." "Faithful," he repeated, and the word came out of him like a curse. "You call yourself faithful while a man's name is written here beside yours, describing meetings I never knew about, promises I never heard you make to me." Her heart pounded so violently she feared it would break through her chest. "Show me the letter. Let me read it myself." "You will not touch it," he said, stepping back from her as though she carried a disease. "You will gather what belongings you can carry tonight, and you will leave this house before the sun rises. I never wish to see your face again." The servants had gathered at the edges of the hallway, pretending to busy themselves with tasks that did not exist, their eyes darting toward the scene unfolding before them. Eleanor felt the shame burn through her chest, hotter than any fire. "We are married," she said, her voice breaking. "Before God and before witnesses. You cannot simply cast me aside like a servant who has displeased you." "Our marriage was kept secret from the world," Julian said coldly. "No one outside this house knows you are my wife. It will be simple enough to make certain no one ever does." The cruelty in his words stole the breath from her lungs. She had known, when they married in secret months ago, that his family's enemies would use her against him if given the chance, that his position required caution until the political storm surrounding his father's estate had settled. She had accepted the secrecy because she trusted him, because she loved him with a depth she had never expected to feel for any man. Now that trust lay shattered on the marble floor between them. "I am carrying your child," she said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. She had meant to tell him gently, over a quiet dinner, perhaps with flowers on the table and his hand in hers. She had not meant for it to come out as a desperate plea in the middle of a hallway filled with staring servants. For one moment, something flickered across Julian's face, a crack in the wall of his anger. But then his jaw tightened again, and the coldness returned, colder than before. "A convenient claim," he said, made at a convenient moment. "Do you think I am a fool, Eleanor? Do you think tears and clever words will undo what I have read with my own eyes?" "It is not a claim," she said, pressing her hand against her stomach as though to shield the small life growing there from his words. "It is the truth. I have suspected for 3 weeks. I was going to tell you tonight, before you came home with that terrible letter and this terrible temper." "Enough," he said, and the word cracked through the hallway like a whip. "I will not stand here and listen to more falsehoods. Mrs. Bramwell will help you pack what is yours. You have until dawn." He turned and walked away from her, his boots striking the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the vast, empty house, each step carrying him further from the woman he had once promised to cherish for the rest of his life. Eleanor stood alone in the hallway, the candle still trembling in her hand, wax now cooling and hard against her fingers. She looked at the servants who would not meet her eyes, at the portraits of Ashford ancestors staring down from the walls, at the life she had built here now crumbling around her feet. Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper, approached her slowly, her face pale with sympathy she dared not show too openly. "Come, my lady," she said softly, using the title that would soon mean nothing at all. "Let us gather your things." In her chamber, Eleanor packed with trembling hands, choosing only what she truly needed, leaving behind the fine gowns Julian had given her, the jewels that marked her as his wife, everything that might one day be used as proof against her, if his family's enemies came searching. She kept only a simple dress, a warm cloak, and the small locket her own mother had given her before she passed, the one possession from her old life that had followed her into this one. As she worked, her mind raced back through the months of her marriage, searching for any moment that might explain the letter Julian had shown her, the accusation that had destroyed everything between them in the span of a single evening. She could think of nothing. She had spent her days quietly, tending to the house, writing letters to her aunt in the countryside, walking in the gardens when the weather allowed. She had met no secret lover, made no secret promises. Someone had lied, and lied with terrible skill. She thought of Edgar Voss, Julian's cousin, who had grown increasingly present in the house over the past 2 months, always finding reasons to speak with Julian in private, always watching Eleanor with an expression she had never quite been able to name. She had mentioned her unease to Julian once, and he had laughed it off, calling Edgar harmless, calling her imagination overactive. Now she wondered if her instincts had been right all along, and if she had simply lacked the proof to convince him. But proof mattered little now. Julian had made his decision, and no amount of wondering would change the fact that she was to leave his house before dawn, carrying his child and nothing else that mattered. Mrs. Bramwell helped her fasten her cloak, her hands lingering a moment longer than necessary, a small gesture of comfort in a night that offered none. "Where will you go, my lady?" she asked quietly. Eleanor had not thought that far ahead. Her aunt lived 2 days' travel away, too far to reach on foot, and too dangerous to reach by hired carriage without funds, since Julian had taken back the small purse of coins he had given her for household expenses, declaring that nothing in this house belonged to her any longer. She had a few coins of her own, saved from selling a ribbon or a bonnet she no longer wanted, hardly enough to secure a room for more than a night or two. "I will find somewhere," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice that she did not feel inside. "I always have." She descended the servants' staircase rather than the grand front stairs, unwilling to walk past the portraits and mirrors that had once reflected her happiness back at her. At the servants' entrance, a young girl named Susan Whitfield, who worked in the kitchen and had always been kind to Eleanor, pressed a small parcel of bread and cheese into her hands. "For the journey, my lady," Susan whispered, glancing over her shoulder. To be certain, no one saw the exchange. "I am sorry for what has happened to you. None of us believe the things they are saying." Eleanor squeezed the girl's hand in gratitude, unable to find words that would not break the fragile control she held over her own emotions. Then she stepped out into the cold night air, the great door of Kensworth House closing behind her with a sound as final as a coffin lid. The streets of London stretched before her, dark and unfamiliar in the way that only a woman who has never walked them alone can find them. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and pressed a hand once more to her stomach, silently promising the small life within her that she would find a way forward, even if she did not yet know what that way might be. She had not walked far when she passed the small church where she and Julian had married in secret only a few months before. The building stood dark and quiet, its windows reflecting nothing but the pale light of the moon. She stopped for a moment, remembering the warmth of his hand around hers as they had spoken their vows before a handful of trusted witnesses, remembering how certain she had felt that nothing could ever come between them. That certainty now felt like a memory belonging to a different woman entirely, someone foolish enough to believe that love alone could protect her from the world. She thought of her father, gone 3 years now, and wondered what he would say if he could see his daughter standing alone on a London street at midnight, carrying a child whose own father refused to believe he existed. He had always warned her that the world was unkind to women who trusted too easily, and she had always believed she was clever enough to avoid his warning. Tonight, that cleverness had failed her completely. A carriage rattled past, its lamps casting brief light across the cobblestones, before vanishing into the darkness ahead. Eleanor stepped further into the shadow of a shop front, unwilling to be seen by anyone who might recognize her, though she knew the chance of that was small. Few people in London knew her face at all, since Julian had kept her so carefully hidden these past months, a caution that now worked against her in a different way, leaving her utterly friendless in a city of thousands. She thought too of the letter he had refused to let her see, the one that had turned him from a loving husband into a stranger in the space of a single conversation. Someone had crafted it with care, someone who understood exactly what words would wound Julian most deeply, exactly what accusations he would believe without question. She did not yet have a name to place upon her enemy, but she felt certain, with a conviction she could not explain, that this cruelty had not come from nowhere. Someone close to Julian had wanted her gone, and had been patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Behind her, in the warmth of his study, Julian Ashford sat with the forged letter spread across his desk, staring at it as though it might rearrange itself into something less devastating if he looked long enough. His hands, still trembling faintly with anger, would not quite settle, and beneath the anger, buried deep enough that he refused to acknowledge it even to himself, a small and frightened voice asked whether he had acted too quickly, whether he had truly looked closely enough at the letter before believing every word it contained. He pushed the thought away and poured himself a glass of brandy he did not drink. He did not see the shadow that crossed the doorway behind him, nor the small, satisfied smile that touched the lips of the man watching him from the hall. A man who had spent 2 months crafting this very moment, and who now watched his cousin destroy his own happiness with quiet, careful pleasure. Edgar Voss stepped back into the darkness before Julian could turn and notice him, content to let the night's work settle exactly as he had planned it. Eleanor walked on through the darkened streets, not knowing that the man who claimed to know the truth had been deceived by the very person who stood to gain the most from her absence, and not knowing that the child growing within her would one day become the single thread capable of unraveling every lie that had been spun against her. For now, she knew only the cold air against her face, the weight of the small parcel of bread in her hands, and the terrible silence of a city that had no place waiting for her within it. She walked toward the poorer streets near the river, where she had once heard a maid mention that rooms could be found cheaply, and where, perhaps, a stranger might be willing to offer shelter to a woman with nowhere else in the world left to turn. The room above the seamstress's shop smelled of wool and lavender, a small comfort in the days following Eleanor's expulsion from Kensworth House. Margaret Hale, a widow who had run her small shop near the river for 15 years, had found Eleanor sitting on a doorstep 2 streets away, shivering in the early morning cold, and had not asked a single question before offering her a place to sleep. "You look like a woman who has lost everything in one night," Margaret said, guiding her inside with a firm but gentle hand. "I have seen that look before. My own sister wore it once." Eleanor accepted the kindness with a gratitude too deep for words, though she offered what explanation she could manage, without revealing the full truth of her marriage. She spoke only of a broken engagement, a family who had cast her out, details vague enough to protect Julian's name and her own safety, since she still did not know whether his family's enemies might use her against him if her identity became known. The first weeks passed in a haze of exhaustion and sickness. Eleanor's stomach rebelled against nearly everything she tried to eat, and she spent many mornings kneeling beside a basin, her body weak from the effort, her mind circling endlessly around the night Julian had ordered her from his house. She wondered, in her weaker moments, whether she should simply return and beg him to listen, to look at her honestly, instead of through the lens of whatever poison had been poured into his ear. But pride, and fear of another rejection, kept her feet firmly planted in Margaret's small shop. Margaret taught her needlework in exchange for her help around the shop, a skill Eleanor had only practiced casually before but now applied herself to with a fierce determination. She stitched hems and mended tiers from dawn, until her eyes grew too tired to see the thread clearly, earning a few coins for every finished garment, enough to contribute toward her keep, and slowly build a small store of savings hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room. "You have a gift for this," Margaret observed one evening, examining a bodice Eleanor had just finished repairing. "Your stitches are finer than mine, and I have been doing this since I was a girl of 12. Eleanor managed a small smile. "One of the first genuine ones since that terrible night. My mother taught me. She used to say a woman should always have a skill that belongs to her alone, something no husband or father could take from her." "Wise woman," Margaret said. "Where is she now?" "She passed when I was 16, Eleanor answered quietly. "I have missed her every day since, but never more than these past weeks." Margaret did not press further, sensing the weight behind Eleanor's words, but she began to watch her young lodger more closely after that conversation, noting the way Eleanor's hand sometimes drifted to her stomach when she thought no one observed her, the way her face paled at certain smells that had never troubled her before. It did not take a woman of Margaret's experience long to understand what Eleanor was carrying, though she said nothing of her suspicions until Eleanor was ready to speak of it herself. That moment came on a rainy evening in her 3rd week at the shop, when Eleanor's sickness overtook her so severely that she nearly fainted while climbing the narrow stairs to her room. Margaret caught her by the arm, guided her to a chair, and pressed a cool cloth to her forehead with practiced hands. "How far along are you, child?" she asked gently, no judgment in her voice at all. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for weeks. "Nearly 2 months, I believe, perhaps a little more." "And the father?" Margaret asked. "Does he know?" "He knows," Eleanor said bitterly, "and he did not believe me. He called it a convenient claim, made it a convenient moment. He ordered me from his house that same night." Margaret's expression hardened, though her hands remained gentle as she continued tending to Eleanor. "Then he is a fool, whoever he is, and not worth another moment of your tears. You will stay here as long as you need. This child will not want for shelter while I have breath in my body." The relief Eleanor felt at those words nearly broke the last of her composure. She had spent so many nights fearing that she would have to face the coming months entirely alone, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand firmly at her side. She thanked Margaret with a voice choked by emotion, and that night, for the first time since leaving Kensworth House, she slept without dreaming of Julian's cold eyes staring down at her in the hallway. But sleep did not erase the questions that continued to circle through her mind during her waking hours. She thought often of the forged letter, turning over every detail she could recall from that terrible evening, searching for some thread that might lead her toward the truth. She remembered Edgar Voss's careful, watchful presence in the months before her expulsion, his habit of arriving at Kensworth House with business that always seemed to require lengthy private conversations with Julian, conversations that grew more frequent as the weeks passed. She decided, after much deliberation, that she owed it to herself and to her unborn child to make one final attempt to reach Julian, to explain the truth in a way he could not dismiss so easily as he had dismissed her tearful pleas that night. A letter, she reasoned, might succeed where her voice had failed, since he would have time to read her words calmly, without the heat of the moment clouding his judgment. She spent 2 evenings composing the letter, choosing each word with the greatest possible care. She described the child growing within her, gave the approximate date she believed the child had been conceived, a date that would prove, beyond any doubt, that no other man could be responsible. She wrote of her innocence regarding the accusations in the forged letter, begging him to investigate its origins rather than accept it blindly. She wrote, finally, of her enduring love for him, despite everything he had done, a confession that cost her more pride than she cared to admit even to herself. Margaret helped her arrange for the letter to be delivered discreetly, entrusting it to a young errand boy who frequented the shop and could be trusted, Margaret assured her, to deliver messages without asking unwanted questions. Eleanor watched the boy disappear down the street with her letter tucked inside his coat, her heart pounding with a fragile hope she had not allowed herself to feel in weeks. What Eleanor did not know and could not have suspected was that the errand boy's path toward Kensworth House would take him past a small tavern frequented by servants from several great houses in the neighborhood, a tavern where Edgar Voss had, quite deliberately, cultivated relationships with staff who might prove useful to him. One such servant, a footman eager to earn a few extra coins, recognized the boy as one who often carried messages for the poorer residents near the river, and mentioned as much, quite innocently, during a conversation with Edgar later that same evening. Edgar's instincts, sharpened by 2 months of careful scheming, told him immediately that something required his attention. He made inquiries the following morning, subtle and unhurried, and by afternoon he had learned enough to grow deeply concerned. A woman near the river recently arrived, sending letters to Kensworth House. It could be nothing. It could be everything he had worked so hard to prevent. He intercepted the letter before it ever reached Julian's hands, paying the errand boy a sum far greater than Eleanor had offered, claiming falsely that he had been sent by the Duke himself to collect any correspondence meant for the household. The boy, seeing no reason to doubt a well-dressed gentleman claiming such authority, handed over the letter without hesitation and pocketed his unexpected fortune with a satisfied grin. Edgar read Eleanor's words alone in his private chambers that night, his expression growing darker with every line. The date she mentioned, the details of her condition, the sincerity that bled through every sentence, all of it threatened to undo the careful lies he had spent so long constructing. If Julian read this letter, if he allowed himself even a moment's doubt about the forged accusation, the entire scheme might collapse, and with it, Edgar's carefully nurtured hope of one day inheriting the title and fortune that currently stood between him and true power. He burned the letter in the small fireplace of his chambers, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained of Eleanor's desperate hope but ash. He told himself the action was necessary, a small cruelty in service of a larger ambition, and he pushed away the small, uncomfortable knowledge that an innocent woman and an innocent child now suffered for his design. Eleanor waited for a response that would never come. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, and still no word arrived from Kensworth House. Her fragile hope withered slowly, replaced by a hardened resolve she had not known she possessed. If Julian would not come to her, if he would not even acknowledge her letter, then she would build a life for herself and her child without him, no matter how difficult the path ahead might prove. She threw herself further into her work at the shop, her needlework growing steadily finer, her reputation among Margaret's customers slowly growing alongside it. She began to imagine a future entirely separate from the one she had once planned as Julian's wife. A smaller life, perhaps, but one built on her own strength rather than on promises that had proven so easily broken. She did not know that her letter had never reached its intended reader, that Julian remained entirely ignorant of her condition, her innocence, and her continued suffering. She did not know that the man responsible for destroying her marriage watched her, even now, from a careful distance, ensuring that no further attempt at reconciliation would succeed. And she certainly did not know that her quiet determination to survive, to build something new from the ruins of her old life, would one day become the very foundation upon which her vindication would eventually be built. Margaret noticed the change in her young lodger over the following weeks, the way sorrow slowly transformed into something sturdier, something Margaret recognized from her own years of widowhood. She began teaching Eleanor more than simple stitching, showing her how to manage the accounts of the shop, how to speak with customers who came seeking fine work for special occasions, how to negotiate fair prices for the fabrics and threads that arrived from merchants along the river. A woman who understands her own worth is far harder to cast aside, Margaret told her one afternoon, as they sat together sorting spools of colored thread by the window. I do not say this to wound you further, but only because I wish you to hear it. You gave that man your whole heart, and he repaid you with cruelty. Do not make the same mistake twice, with any man, ever again. Eleanor turned the words over in her mind long after Margaret had spoken them, recognizing the truth in them even as they stung. She had loved Julian completely, had trusted him with a devotion that left her utterly unprepared for the speed with which he turned against her. She resolved, quietly and privately, that whatever came next in her life, she would never again place her entire happiness so completely in another person's hands. As the weeks passed, her body began to change in ways she could no longer easily hide beneath loose clothing, and she grew more cautious about venturing into the busier streets near the market, fearful of encountering anyone who might recognize her from her brief months as Julian's secret wife. She kept mostly to the shop and the quiet lanes near the river, venturing out only when necessary, always with her hood drawn close around her face. One afternoon, while delivering a finished gown to a customer several streets away, she caught sight of a carriage bearing the Ashford family crest, and her heart seized with such sudden terror that she pressed herself into a narrow alley until it had passed. She told herself, once her pulse had calmed, that Julian would have no reason to search for her in this part of London, that the carriage likely carried some other member of his household on some errand entirely unrelated to her. Still, the encounter left her shaken for the remainder of the day, a reminder that the world she had once belonged to remained uncomfortably close, even as it felt impossibly far away. She thought, too, in quieter moments, of the child growing within her, wondering whether she carried a son who might one day resemble Julian's proud bearing, or a daughter who might inherit her own mother's gentle nature. Whatever the child turned out to be, she promised herself, over and over, that he or she would grow up knowing love and safety, even if that love came only from Eleanor and Margaret, without any father's presence at all. Margaret's shop, though modest, attracted a steady stream of customers from the surrounding neighborhood, women who needed gowns mended or new garments made for weddings and christenings, and the countless small occasions that filled ordinary lives. Eleanor found unexpected comfort in the rhythm of this work, in the simple satisfaction of transforming plain fabric into something beautiful with her own two hands. It was nothing like the idle days she had spent as Julian's hidden wife, waiting anxiously for his return each evening, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she preferred this new life's honest labor to the gilded uncertainty of her old one. Yet beneath the growing calm of her days, a persistent unease remained. She could not shake the feeling that her silence from Julian meant something more troubling than simple indifference. A man capable of such fury on the night he cast her out seemed unlikely to simply forget her existence entirely, and she wondered, with growing unease, whether some further danger might yet be lurking in the shadows of her old life, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She did not know how right her instincts would prove to be, nor how close that danger already stood, watching her from a distance she could not yet perceive. Edgar Voss had spent the better part of 10 years watching his cousin Julian inherit every advantage life had to offer, while he himself remained forever second, forever the spare relation invited to family gatherings out of obligation rather than affection. He had smiled through every celebration of Julian's achievements, had offered warm congratulations at Julian's wedding to a woman he had never even been permitted to meet, and had nursed, beneath that pleasant exterior, a resentment that had grown sharper with every passing year. The Ashford title and fortune would pass to Edgar only if Julian died without an heir, a possibility that had once seemed comfortably distant, since Julian was young and healthy and clearly intended to marry and produce children in due course. But when Edgar learned, through careful inquiry among the household staff, that Julian had married in secret, his comfortable distance suddenly collapsed into urgent necessity. A secret wife might easily produce a secret heir, and Edgar could not allow such a thing to happen without a fight. He began his campaign quietly, visiting Kensworth House with increasing frequency under the guise of family duty and business concern, always finding reasons to speak with Julian privately, always careful never to mention Eleanor directly in a way that might arouse suspicion. He studied her habits from a distance, learned her schedule, discovered which merchants delivered to the house and on which days, and slowly built a picture of her life detailed enough to construct a lie convincing enough to destroy it. The forged letter had taken him nearly a month to perfect. He had studied examples of Eleanor's handwriting, taken from notes she had left for household staff, and practiced copying her careful, elegant script until he could reproduce it well enough to fool even someone who knew her intimately. He crafted the letter's contents with equal precision, inventing a fictional lover with just enough detail to feel real, a name common enough to belong to any number of men in London, meetings described with just enough specificity to feel authentic without being verifiable. He had chosen his moment carefully as well, waiting until Julian returned from a difficult meeting regarding his father's estate, a meeting Edgar himself had helped arrange, knowing it would leave Julian exhausted, frustrated, and primed for anger rather than careful judgment. He had placed the letter where Julian would find it easily, in a stack of correspondence delivered that very afternoon, and had made certain to be nowhere near Kensworth House when Julian discovered it, ensuring no suspicion could fall upon him. The plan had worked more perfectly than even Edgar had dared hope. Julian's fury, once ignited, burned so fiercely that he had cast Eleanor from the house within hours of reading the forged letter, never pausing to question its authenticity, never considering that his cousin might possess both the motive and the means to deceive him so completely. In the weeks following Eleanor's expulsion, Edgar worked to consolidate his position further, offering himself as a source of comfort and counsel to his grieving, guilt-ridden cousin. He encouraged Julian's anger whenever it flared, gently discouraged any moment of doubt that threatened to surface, and slowly began inserting himself into the management of the Ashford estate's finances, a role that had never been offered to him before Eleanor's departure created such convenient chaos within the household. "You must not let doubt weaken your resolve," Edgar told Julian one evening, as the two men sat together in the study where the forged letter had first been discovered. "A woman capable of such betrayal does not deserve a second thought, let alone a second chance." Julian stared into his glass of brandy, his expression troubled in a way that had become increasingly common over the past weeks. "I keep thinking of the way she looked at me, Edgar. The certainty in her voice when she denied everything. I have never known Eleanor to lie to me, not once, in all our months together." "Grief has a way of making even the guilty seem sincere," Edgar said smoothly, his voice carrying just the right measure of sympathy. "Do not torture yourself with doubt over a woman who showed you so little loyalty. You did what honor required, nothing more." Julian nodded slowly, though the troubled expression did not fully leave his face, a small crack in his conviction that Edgar noted with quiet concern. He would need to work harder, he realized, to ensure that crack did not widen into something capable of undoing all his careful planning. Edgar's control over the household finances grew steadily over the following weeks, as Julian, distracted by his own turmoil, delegated more and more responsibility to his cousin's willing hands. Edgar reviewed accounts, approved expenditures, and slowly began redirecting small sums toward his own private purposes, careful never to take enough to arouse suspicion, patient enough to understand that true wealth would only come to him once Julian's line ended entirely, once the title passed to him in full and permanent right. He had not counted on Eleanor's persistence, however, and the intercepted letter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. If she had managed to send one message despite her poverty and isolation, she might attempt to send another, and Edgar could not guarantee he would intercept every future attempt with equal success. He decided the safest course of action would be to learn more about her current circumstances, to understand exactly how much danger she still posed to his careful scheme. He hired a man named Fletcher, a former runner for the local magistrate who had left that position under circumstances Edgar chose not to inquire about too closely, to discreetly investigate the seamstress shop near the river and the woman who now lodged there. Fletcher's reports, delivered weekly in a small, cramped hand, confirmed Edgar's worst fears. Eleanor remained in London, remained visibly with child, and remained, according to Fletcher's careful observations, determined and resourceful, despite her reduced circumstances. "She grows stronger by the week," Fletcher reported during one of their private meetings in a quiet corner of a tavern far from anywhere either man might be recognized. "The seamstress has taken quite a liking to her, teaches her the business, from what I can observe. If the child comes and turns out to be a son, and word ever reaches the Duke of its existence, I imagine he would investigate the matter far more thoroughly than he did the first time." Edgar's fingers tightened around his glass at the thought. A son would be catastrophic to his plans, an undeniable heir, with a claim that no forged letter could permanently obscure once Julian's suspicions were properly roused. He needed to ensure that such suspicions never took root, and if they did, he needed to be prepared to act decisively before they could grow into anything resembling proof. "Continue watching her," Edgar instructed Fletcher. "Report to me immediately if she attempts any further contact with the household, or if anyone from Kensworth House begins asking questions about her whereabouts. I will pay you well for your discretion, and even better for your speed." Fletcher nodded, pocketing the coins Edgar slid across the table, and disappeared back into the London evening to continue his quiet surveillance. Edgar remained a while longer in the tavern, turning his wineglass slowly in his hand, contemplating the delicate balance he now maintained. He had achieved much already, had positioned himself closer to the Ashford title and fortune than he had ever managed in 10 long years of patient waiting. But the balance remained fragile, dependent entirely on Eleanor's continued silence, and Julian's continued belief in a lie that grew more precarious with each passing week. He returned to Kensworth House that night to find Julian once again brooding over correspondence in his study, though this time the letters concerned estate business rather than personal betrayal. Edgar settled into a chair across from his cousin, adopting his usual mask of concerned family support. "You seem troubled again this evening," Edgar observed, watching Julian carefully for any sign of the doubt that had begun to worry him in recent weeks. "I received a strange note today," Julian said, frowning at a paper in his hand, "from a solicitor claiming to represent Eleanor's aunt in the countryside. She writes asking after Eleanor's whereabouts, saying she has not heard from her niece in several weeks and grows concerned." Edgar's expression remained carefully neutral, though his mind raced through the implications of this unexpected development. He had not accounted for the possibility of family inquiries reaching Julian through channels he could not easily intercept or control. "What did you tell the solicitor?" "Nothing yet," Julian admitted. "I have not decided what to say. I could hardly explain that I cast my own wife out into the streets over an accusation I never allowed her to properly answer." He set the paper down and rubbed his temples with visible exhaustion. "Edgar, I begin to wonder if I acted too swiftly that night. The letter, when I examine my memory of it now, seems almost too convenient, too perfectly timed to arrive just when it would cause the most damage." This was precisely the doubt Edgar had feared, precisely the crack in Julian's conviction he had worked so hard to prevent from widening. He forced a reassuring smile onto his face, though beneath the calm exterior, his mind worked quickly to find some new angle of persuasion that might restore his cousin's certainty. "Grief plays tricks on the mind," Edgar said gently. "It is natural to second-guess a painful decision, especially one made in anger, but do not let doubt undo the wisdom of your original judgment. If you truly wish to ease your conscience, I could make discreet inquiries on your behalf, spare you the burden of investigating a matter that clearly causes you such pain." Julian looked at him with something like gratitude, entirely unaware of the danger such an offer truly represented. "Would you, Edgar? I would be deeply grateful for the assistance. I find I have not the strength to pursue the matter myself, not while the wound still feels so raw." "Consider it done," Edgar said, already calculating how he might direct any investigation toward conclusions that would further condemn Eleanor rather than exonerate her. "Leave the matter entirely in my hands. I will ensure the truth, whatever it may be, comes to light in due course." He left Kensworth House that night with a new sense of urgency pressing against his careful calm. Julian's doubt, however small, represented a threat he had not anticipated, and the solicitor's inquiry represented a thread that, if pulled too far, might unravel everything he had built. He would need to move more decisively now, to ensure that whatever investigation Julian believed was taking place led only toward conclusions that served Edgar's own interests, while the true threat, Eleanor herself and the child she carried, remained safely hidden from Julian's awareness for as long as Edgar could possibly manage it. As he rode back to his own modest lodgings, considerably less grand than the estate he coveted, Edgar allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection on how far he had already traveled down this path of deception. He had told himself, in the beginning, that this was simply strategy, simply the natural maneuvering of a man seeking to secure his rightful future. But the solicitor's letter, and the genuine anguish he had witnessed on Julian's face, reminded him uncomfortably that real people suffered for his ambition, a woman cast into poverty, a child who might never know its father, a cousin tormented by guilt over a decision built entirely on lies. He pushed the discomfort away, as he always did, and turned his thoughts instead toward Fletcher's next report, toward the careful next steps required to protect everything he had worked so patiently to secure. Whatever guilt lingered at the edges of his conscience, it was not, he told himself firmly, enough to make him abandon a plan now so close to fruition. The following morning, Edgar drafted a careful reply to the solicitor representing Eleanor's aunt, a letter designed to sound cooperative while revealing nothing of any real use. He wrote that the household regretted to inform the aunt that Eleanor had left Kensworth House some weeks prior under circumstances that remained a private family matter, and that any further inquiries should be directed through proper legal channels rather than informal correspondence. He signed the letter with Julian's name, having perfected a passable imitation of his cousin's signature over years of handling estate business on his behalf, and sent it before Julian could see the contents or question the tone. He hoped the vague, formal language would discourage further inquiry, but he understood that a determined aunt, worried for her niece's safety, might not be so easily deterred. He resolved to have Fletcher watch not only Eleanor herself but any correspondence that might pass between her and her remaining family, a task that grew more complicated with each new thread he needed to monitor. Meanwhile, Julian's doubt continued to grow, slowly and quietly, in ways that troubled Edgar more than he cared to admit even to himself. Julian began asking questions about the night of Eleanor's departure that he had never thought to ask before, wondering aloud how the letter had come to arrive at precisely that moment, wondering who among the household staff might have witnessed anything unusual in the days leading up to its discovery. Edgar answered each question with practiced calm, redirecting suspicion wherever he could, but he felt, for the first time since setting his scheme in motion, a genuine current of fear beneath his careful composure. He began spending more time at Kensworth House, not merely to maintain his influence over Julian but to monitor the household staff directly, watching for any servant who might prove too observant, too willing to share an inconvenient memory if asked the right question by the right person. He found, to his growing unease, that several members of the staff had grown noticeably cold toward him since Eleanor's departure, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the way they addressed him, the way their eyes lingered on him a moment too long when he passed through the halls. One servant in particular concerned him greatly. Peter Lowell, a young footman who had served the household for only a year, had been present in the hallway on the night Julian confronted Eleanor, and Edgar had noticed him watching with an expression that seemed to carry more understanding than a mere servant ought to possess. Edgar made discreet inquiries about the young man's background, his loyalties, his financial circumstances, searching for any leverage that might ensure his continued silence, should his suspicions ever solidify into something more dangerous. What Edgar did not know was that Peter Lowell had in fact witnessed something deeply troubling in the weeks before Eleanor's expulsion, a fragment of memory that had nagged at him ever since without quite resolving itself into full clarity. He recalled, though he had not thought much of it at the time, seeing Edgar Voss seated at the small writing desk in the estate's rarely used morning room late one evening, the papers spread before him, his manner secretive when Peter had entered unexpectedly to tend the fire. Edgar had covered the papers quickly and dismissed him with unusual sharpness, a moment so small it might have meant nothing at all, had it not occurred only days before the forged letter appeared in Julian's correspondence. Peter had said nothing of this memory to anyone, uncertain of its significance and wary of accusing a member of the family without proof. But the memory lingered, resurfacing at odd moments, particularly whenever he observed Edgar's increasingly frequent presence at Kensworth House and the growing control he seemed to hold over matters that had once belonged entirely to Julian himself. Edgar, sensing something guarded in the young footman's demeanor without quite understanding its source, decided that caution required him to keep Peter Lowell close, rather than risk arousing further suspicion through obvious avoidance. He began offering the footman small favors, occasional additional coins for minor errands, gestures designed to appear generous while subtly binding the young man's loyalty, or at least his silence, more firmly to Edgar's own interests. Peter accepted the coins with outward gratitude, though inwardly his unease only deepened with each interaction, his instincts warning him that something beneath Edgar's pleasant manner did not sit right, though he could not yet articulate precisely what troubled him so thoroughly. He resolved to watch more carefully, to remember more precisely, in case the fragments of memory he carried might one day prove important to someone who needed the truth far more desperately than he currently understood. As autumn deepened into winter, the household at Kensworth House settled into an uneasy rhythm. Julian increasingly withdrawn and troubled, Edgar increasingly desperate to maintain his careful web of deception, and the servants increasingly divided between those who trusted the official account of Eleanor's departure and those who harbored quiet doubts they dared not voice aloud. Beneath the surface calm of the great house, tension continued to build, waiting only for the right catalyst to bring every carefully hidden truth crashing into the light. The pains began late on a cold evening, sharp and sudden enough that Eleanor gripped the edge of the work table, and could not immediately answer when Margaret asked what was wrong. Margaret took one look at her pale face and set down her needlework immediately, all business now, her years of experience with the neighborhood's births guiding her through the sudden shift from seamstress to midwife. "The child comes tonight," Margaret said firmly, already moving toward the small store of clean linens she kept prepared for exactly this occasion. "Do not be afraid. I have helped bring a dozen babies into this world, and every one of them arrived safely." Eleanor nodded, though fear pressed heavily against her chest, despite Margaret's reassurance. She thought, in the long hours that followed, of her own mother, of how much she wished for her guidance now, in this moment that felt at once terrifying and impossibly significant. She thought too, briefly and against her own wishes, of Julian, wondering whether he would ever know that his child had been born, whether he would ever care to know at all. The labor stretched long into the night, Margaret's steady voice and capable hands guiding Eleanor through each difficult hour, until finally, as the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the small window of her room, a thin cry filled the space where only pain and exhaustion had existed moments before. "A son," Margaret announced, her voice thick with emotion despite her years of experience. "A fine, healthy son." Eleanor took the small bundle into her arms, exhaustion forgotten entirely, as she looked down at the tiny face that stared back at her, with an expression of solemn curiosity. He had Julian's dark hair, she noticed immediately, and something in the shape of his small chin that reminded her painfully of his father, a resemblance she suspected would only grow stronger as he aged. "What will you name him?" Margaret asked, helping Eleanor settle back against the pillows with the practiced gentleness of a woman who had performed this same task many times before. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, watching her son's tiny fingers curl instinctively around her own. "Henry," she said finally. "Henry Ashford, though the world may never know the second name belongs to him rightfully." Margaret's expression softened with sympathy, understanding the weight behind Eleanor's words, the injustice of a child born to legitimate marriage, yet forced to live as though that legitimacy had never existed. "He is a beautiful boy, whatever name the world chooses to call him by. You should be proud, Eleanor. You have brought a strong, healthy child into this world despite everything working against you." The weeks following Henry's birth passed in a haze of exhausted happiness, Eleanor discovering depths of love within herself she had not fully anticipated, even after months of anticipating his arrival. She adjusted her work schedule around his needs, nursing him through the night and stitching hems during whatever quiet hours he allowed her, building a small routine that, while exhausting, brought a satisfaction unlike anything she had known in her previous life of idle comfort, as Julian's hidden wife. Margaret proved as devoted to little Henry as she had been to Eleanor herself, often taking the child for an hour or two so Eleanor could rest properly or focus fully on a particularly demanding piece of needlework. "He is as much a part of this household now as either of us," Margaret said one afternoon, bouncing Henry gently on her knee, while Eleanor finished a delicate embroidery pattern for a wealthy customer's christening gown. "I never had children of my own, you know. My husband and I were not blessed that way. I did not expect, at my age, to feel this much joy over another woman's son." Eleanor smiled, watching the easy affection between Margaret and Henry, with a warmth that eased, however briefly, the persistent ache of Julian's absence from their lives. "He is fortunate to have you, Margaret. We both are. I do not know how I would have survived this past year without your kindness." As Henry grew from a tiny, fragile newborn into a curious, smiling infant, Eleanor's independence grew alongside him. Her reputation as a skilled seamstress had spread quietly through the neighborhood, and several of Margaret's wealthier customers began requesting Eleanor by name for their finest work, a development that allowed her to earn slightly higher wages and, eventually, to consider the possibility of opening her own small shop someday, once she had saved enough and Henry was old enough to spend more time without her constant presence. She thought less frequently of Julian now, though he never fully left her thoughts entirely. She wondered, in quiet moments, whether he had married again, whether he had produced other children who might one day claim an inheritance that rightfully belonged to Henry, whether he ever thought of her at all beyond perhaps a moment's irritation, whenever something reminded him of the scandal he believed she had caused. She told herself these thoughts served no useful purpose, that dwelling on a past she could not change only stole energy she needed for building Henry's future, but she could not always prevent her mind from wandering back to that terrible night in the hallway of Kensworth House. Meanwhile, unknown to Eleanor, Julian's doubt had continued its slow, persistent growth throughout the months of her confinement and Henry's early infancy. The solicitor's inquiry regarding Eleanor's whereabouts had unsettled him more deeply than he initially admitted even to himself, and he found himself, late at night, returning again and again to the details of that fateful evening, searching for inconsistencies that might either confirm or finally dispel the doubt now gnawing steadily at his conscience. He had asked Edgar for updates on the discreet investigation his cousin had promised to conduct, only to receive vague assurances that inquiries continued, but had yet to uncover anything conclusive. The delays frustrated Julian more with each passing week, and he began, cautiously, and without informing Edgar, to make some inquiries of his own, starting with the household staff who had witnessed the events of that terrible night firsthand. He approached Mrs. Bramwell first, the housekeeper who had helped Eleanor pack her few belongings before her departure. Her responses, though carefully measured out of loyalty to the household she served, contained just enough hesitation, just enough unspoken sympathy for Eleanor, that Julian sensed there was more to the story than he had originally believed. "Did she seem to you like a woman capable of the betrayal described in that letter?" Julian asked directly, watching the housekeeper's face for any reaction she might struggle to conceal. Mrs. Bramwell hesitated a long moment before answering, clearly weighing her words with great care. "Your Grace, I have served this household for many years, and I have observed a great many marriages within it. I never once saw Lady Eleanor behave toward you with anything less than complete devotion. Whether that observation carries any weight against a written letter, I cannot say, but I offer it honestly, as you have asked." Julian dismissed her with a troubled nod, her words settling uncomfortably into the growing pile of doubt he could no longer easily dismiss. He sought out Peter Lowell next, remembering the young footman's presence in the hallway that night, hoping perhaps for some additional detail that might finally clarify the truth one way or another. Peter, nervous at being summoned directly by the Duke himself, answered his questions carefully, revealing little at first out of uncertainty regarding his own fragmented memories and fear of speaking against a member of the family without sufficient proof. But something in Julian's evident distress, the genuine anguish visible beneath his composed exterior, eventually persuaded the young footman to share the small detail that had troubled him for months. "Your Grace," Peter said hesitantly, "I do not know if this means anything at all, but I recall seeing Mr. Voss at the writing desk in the morning room, some days before the letter appeared, working on papers he covered quickly when I entered unexpectedly. I thought little of it at the time, but given everything that has happened since, I have wondered whether it might be significant." Julian's expression shifted from confusion to something colder, more focused, as the implications of Peter's words settled fully into his mind. "Why did you not mention this before, when the letter first appeared?" "I was not certain it meant anything, Your Grace, and I did not wish to accuse Mr. Voss of something so serious without proper cause. It was only a small moment, easily explained by innocent business, perhaps." Julian dismissed Peter with quiet thanks, his mind now racing through implications he had never previously considered. Edgar, writing secretly at a desk days before the forged letter appeared. Edgar, who stood to inherit everything, should Julian's line end without an heir. Edgar, who had so conveniently offered to investigate the very scandal that had driven Eleanor from the house, an investigation that had produced nothing but delays and vague assurances in the months since. The pieces, once scattered and unconnected, began to align themselves into a picture Julian found himself unable to ignore any longer. A picture that painted his trusted cousin not as a source of comfort and support during his time of grief, but as the very architect of that grief itself. He resolved that same evening to conduct his own quiet investigation, separate entirely from anything Edgar might report back to him, determined finally to uncover the truth that had eluded him for far too long. He began by seeking out a man skilled in the examination of handwriting, a specialist occasionally consulted by the courts when questions of forgery arose in matters of inheritance or contract. He retrieved the forged letter from the locked drawer where he had kept it since that terrible night, unable until now to look at it without being overwhelmed by anger, and brought it to the specialist under a false name, unwilling to reveal the full scope of his suspicions until he possessed more concrete evidence. The specialist examined the letter for the better part of an hour, comparing it against several genuine samples of Eleanor's handwriting that Julian had also retrieved, notes and small correspondence she had left for household matters during her time at Kensworth House. When the specialist finally spoke, his conclusions struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. "The hand is remarkably skilled," the specialist said, holding both samples up to the light streaming through his study window, "but not perfect. Note here, where the letters begin to slant more heavily toward the end of longer words, a fatigue in the forger's control that does not appear in your genuine sample. And here, the crossing of certain letters shows a hesitation, a carefulness that suggests someone copying rather than writing naturally. I would stake my professional reputation on this letter being a forgery, Your Grace, crafted by someone with significant skill, but a forgery nonetheless. Julian left the specialist's office with his hands trembling, though this time from a very different emotion than the fury that had consumed him on the night of Eleanor's expulsion. Guilt, sharp and merciless, tore through him as he considered the full weight of what he had done, casting out his wife, the mother of his child if her claim had indeed been truthful, based entirely on a lie crafted by someone within his own trusted circle. He returned to Kensworth House determined to find Eleanor immediately, to beg her forgiveness and bring her home where she belonged, only to realize, with mounting horror, that he had no idea where to even begin searching. Months had passed since her departure. She could be anywhere in London, or she might have left the city entirely, seeking refuge with distant relations or friends he knew nothing about. The solicitor's letter regarding her aunt offered one possible avenue, but Edgar had handled that correspondence, and Julian now trusted nothing his cousin had told him regarding the matter. He retrieved the solicitor's original letter from his files and arranged to meet with the man directly, bypassing Edgar entirely this time, determined to uncover whatever information the aunt's inquiry might provide. The solicitor, a careful and professional man, confirmed that the aunt had grown increasingly worried over her niece's prolonged silence, and had received only a brief, formal reply that offered no useful information regarding Eleanor's current circumstances or whereabouts. Did the reply come directly from the Duke? Julian asked, though he already suspected the answer. The letter bore your signature, Your Grace, the solicitor replied, though I confess I found the tone somewhat unlike what I would have expected from a man of your reputation, given the circumstances described. Julian's jaw tightened with fresh anger, though this time the anger burned toward an entirely different target than it had months before. Edgar had forged not only the original letter that destroyed his marriage, but had also intercepted and falsely answered correspondence meant to help Julian find his way back to the truth. The scope of his cousin's deception, layer upon layer of careful lies, left Julian nearly breathless with the enormity of what had been done to him, and to Eleanor, and possibly to a child he had never even been given the chance to know. He resolved, walking back to his carriage through the busy London streets, that he would find Eleanor no matter how long the search required, and that when he found her, he would spend whatever remained of his life making amends for the terrible injustice he had allowed himself to be manipulated into committing against her. Julian's investigation, once begun in earnest, moved with a determination that surprised even himself. He hired his own private inquiry agent, a discreet and capable woman named Charlotte Fenwick, who had built a quiet reputation among London's wealthier families for locating missing persons without drawing unwanted public attention to sensitive family matters. He gave her every detail he could recall about Eleanor, her habits, her likely resources, the small circle of acquaintances she might have turned to in desperation. Charlotte began her search methodically, starting with the poorer districts near the river where a woman with limited funds and no family connections in London might reasonably seek affordable lodging. She visited shops and boarding houses, asked careful questions of shopkeepers and landladies, and within 2 weeks had narrowed her search to a handful of streets near a modest seamstress shop that had gained a reputation for particularly fine needlework over the past year, work that several sources described as far too skilled for the shop's usual output. Meanwhile, Edgar Voss, growing increasingly suspicious of Julian's changed behavior, his sudden reluctance to discuss the ongoing investigation, his tendency to disappear from Kensworth House for hours without explanation, began to fear that his careful web of deception was finally beginning to unravel. He redoubled his surveillance of Eleanor through Fletcher, demanding more frequent reports, more detailed observations, growing increasingly desperate as the walls of his scheme seemed to close in around him from every direction. Fletcher's latest report brought news that filled Edgar with a cold, calculating dread. A woman matching Julian's description of his private inquiry agent had been seen asking questions near the seamstress shop, questions specifically about a young woman with a small child, a description that could only refer to Eleanor and her son Henry, now nearly 6 months old and growing more visibly like his father with each passing week. Edgar understood immediately that time had run out for careful, patient scheming. If Julian's agent found Eleanor, if Julian learned the truth of Henry's existence, everything Edgar had worked to build over the past year would collapse entirely, and worse, he would face consequences far more severe than mere disinheritance should the full scope of his forgery and deception come to light. Desperation, an emotion he had carefully avoided throughout his long campaign of manipulation, now gripped him with an urgency that overrode his usual careful calculation. He decided, in the depths of that desperation, that Eleanor and her child needed to disappear entirely before Julian's agent could locate them, a resolution so far beyond his original intentions that he barely recognized himself in the cold, ruthless plan that began forming in his mind. He would not harm them directly, he told himself, clinging to some remnant of conscience even as he plotted their removal from London entirely, but he would ensure they vanished so thoroughly that Julian's investigation would find nothing but cold trails and dead ends. He summoned Fletcher for an urgent meeting, offering a sum of money far larger than anything he had previously paid for the man's discreet services, an amount substantial enough to secure Fletcher's complete cooperation, regardless of whatever moral hesitation the former runner might otherwise have felt about the task Edgar now described. "I need her removed from London," Edgar said, his voice low and controlled despite the frantic calculation racing beneath his composed exterior. "Her and the child both. Arrange transport to somewhere distant, somewhere she cannot easily return from, or send word to anyone who might help her. I do not care how you accomplish this, only that it happens quickly, and without any trace leading back to either of us." Fletcher hesitated, the scope of the request clearly exceeding whatever comfortable moral boundaries he had maintained throughout his previous work for Edgar. "This is a different matter entirely from watching a woman go about her business, sir. What you describe borders on abduction, and involving a child besides. I want no part of anything that might see me hanged should it go wrong." Edgar pressed more money into Fletcher's reluctant hands, along with promises of ongoing support and protection should any difficulty arise. "Consider it a rescue rather than an abduction, if that eases your conscience. She will be given comfortable lodging far from London, provided for generously, only prevented from returning or communicating with anyone here. No harm will come to her or the child, provided you handle the matter with appropriate care." Fletcher remained uneasy despite Edgar's reassurances, but the promised money, enough to secure his own comfortable future for years to come, ultimately overcame his reservations. He agreed to arrange the matter within the week, before Julian's agent could complete her investigation and discover Eleanor's location for herself. What neither man anticipated was that Peter Lowell, the young footman whose fragmented memory had already provided Julian with his first real clue toward the truth, had continued his own quiet observations of Edgar's behavior in the weeks since their conversation. Peter had grown increasingly convinced that his earlier suspicions carried real weight, and he had taken to watching Edgar's movements more carefully whenever the opportunity arose. A small act of loyalty toward the Duke he served and the truth he sensed remained hidden. He overheard, quite by accident, a fragment of conversation between Edgar and an unfamiliar man in a quiet corner of the estate's stable yard. Enough words carried on the evening breeze to understand that something urgent and troubling was being planned, something involving a woman and a child who needed to be removed from London before someone else could find them. Peter recognized immediately the connection to Eleanor, to the investigation Julian had quietly begun, and understood that whatever Edgar planned needed to be stopped before it could be carried out. He hesitated only briefly before deciding that the risk of confronting a member of the family directly, without absolute proof, mattered far less than the risk of remaining silent while genuine harm befell an innocent woman and child. He sought out Julian immediately, finding him in his study reviewing Charlotte Fenwick's latest report with an expression of cautious hope that Peter's news was about to shatter into something far more urgent. "Your Grace," Peter said, his words tumbling out faster than he intended in his urgency. "I overheard Mr. Voss speaking with a stranger in the stable yard, arranging to remove a woman and child from London within the week, before anyone could find them. I believe he speaks of Lady Eleanor and her son." Julian rose from his desk so quickly that his chair toppled backward, Charlotte's report falling forgotten to the floor as the full weight of Peter's words crashed over him. A son. Eleanor had given birth to a son, and Edgar now planned to spirit them both away before Julian could ever learn the truth, or make amends for the terrible wrong he had committed against them both. "When?" Julian demanded, already moving toward the door, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just learned. "When does this removal take place?" "I do not know precisely, Your Grace, only that it was described as happening within the week, and with great urgency. I believe Mr. Voss fears your investigation is close to discovering the truth." Julian summoned Charlotte Fenwick immediately, demanding whatever information she had gathered regarding Eleanor's precise location, unwilling to wait even a single additional day, now that the danger to her and their child had become so immediate and real. Charlotte, sensing the urgency in Julian's demeanor, confirmed that she had narrowed the search to a specific seamstress shop near the river, though she had not yet confirmed with absolute certainty that the young woman lodging there was indeed Eleanor. "Take me there now," Julian said, already reaching for his coat, "and pray we are not already too late." The carriage ride through London felt endless to Julian, every delay caused by traffic or narrow streets stretching his nerves closer to breaking. His mind filled with terrible visions of Eleanor and their son being taken from him permanently before he could ever have the chance to explain, to apologize, to beg forgiveness for the terrible injustice he had allowed himself to commit against them both. At the same hour, unaware of the danger closing in from two different directions, Eleanor sat in Margaret's shop nursing Henry by the evening fire, unaware that Fletcher had already begun making arrangements for their sudden, forced departure from London, and unaware that Julian himself now raced through the streets toward her, driven by a desperate need to undo the damage of his own cruel mistake before it became permanent and irreversible. Fletcher arrived at the shop just as darkness settled fully over the neighborhood, accompanied by two men Edgar had hired for the physical task of the removal, men chosen for their size and their willingness to overlook the questionable nature of the work in exchange for generous payment. Margaret answered the door, her expression immediately wary at the sight of three unfamiliar men standing on her doorstep at such a late hour. "We seek a young woman who lodges here," Fletcher said, his voice carrying a false politeness that did nothing to ease Margaret's growing alarm. "A matter of family business requires her immediate attention elsewhere." "There is no young woman here who wishes to see strangers at this hour," Margaret said firmly, moving to close the door, though one of Fletcher's companions stepped forward quickly enough to prevent it, his large hand pressing against the wood with a strength Margaret had no hope of matching. The commotion carried through the small shop to where Eleanor sat with Henry, and terror seized her immediately as she recognized, with the sharp instinct of a mother sensing danger, that whatever unfolded at the front door threatened her son directly. She rose quickly, clutching Henry tightly against her chest, and retreated toward the small back room where Margaret stored fabric and supplies, desperately searching for any avenue of escape or concealment. But the back room offered only a single small window, too narrow for an adult to pass through easily, and no other exit that might allow her to flee with Henry into the relative safety of the darkened streets beyond. She heard Margaret's raised voice from the front of the shop, heard the sound of a struggle, heard heavy footsteps beginning to move through the narrow hallway toward the room where she now stood trapped with nowhere left to run. Henry, sensing his mother's terror despite his young age, began to cry, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the small, enclosed space, drawing the attention of the approaching footsteps directly toward her hiding place. Eleanor pressed herself into the corner of the room, shielding Henry's small body with her own, her mind racing through every possible option and finding none that offered any real hope of protecting them both from whatever these strange men intended. The door to the back room swung open, revealing Fletcher's silhouette against the dim light of the front room beyond, his expression carrying an uncomfortable mixture of determination and reluctant guilt that suggested even he understood, on some level, the wrongness of the task he had been paid so generously to complete. "Come quietly, and no harm will come to either of you," Fletcher said, though his voice carried little conviction, as though he himself did not entirely believe his own reassurance. "Resistance will only make this more difficult for everyone involved, including the child." Eleanor pressed further into the corner, her heart pounding with a terror unlike anything she had experienced even on the night Julian cast her from his house, understanding with terrible clarity that this danger threatened not merely her comfort or her pride, but the very safety and freedom of the son she had fought so hard to protect and provide for over these past difficult months. Outside, at that very moment, Julian's carriage finally rounded the corner onto the street where Charlotte Fenwick had confirmed the seamstress shop stood, and through the carriage window, Julian's blood ran cold at the sight of a struggle unfolding on the shop's doorstep, at Margaret's raised voice calling desperately for help, at the unmistakable sound of a child's frightened cries carrying from somewhere within the small building ahead. He did not wait for the carriage to fully stop before throwing open the door and dropping to the street, covering the remaining distance to the shop at a dead run, years of careful composure abandoned entirely in the face of a danger he could not allow himself to arrive even a moment too late to prevent. He reached the doorstep just as one of Fletcher's hired men attempted to pull Margaret aside from the entrance, and Julian's fist connected with the man's jaw before conscious thought had fully caught up with instinct, sending the startled ruffian stumbling backward against the shop's front window. "Your Grace," Charlotte Fenwick called from behind him, having followed close on his heels despite her smaller stature making the run considerably more difficult. "The magistrate's men are only a street away. I sent word the moment we spotted trouble." Julian did not pause to acknowledge her, pushing past the doorway and into the shop's narrow interior, following the sound of Henry's continued cries toward the back room where Fletcher stood, attempting to coax a terrified Eleanor away from the corner, where she had pressed herself protectively around their son. "Step away from her," Julian said, his voice carrying a cold authority that stopped Fletcher mid-motion, the former runner turning to find himself facing not merely an angry stranger, but a duke whose fury radiated from every line of his tense frame. Eleanor looked up at the sound of Julian's voice, and for a moment, shock overwhelmed even her terror, disbelief warring with a desperate, fragile hope that perhaps he had come not to complete the cruelty Edgar had set in motion, but to end it entirely. "Julian," she breathed, scarcely able to trust the evidence of her own eyes. "I did not come to harm you," Julian said quickly, raising his hands to show he carried no weapon, his eyes moving from Eleanor's frightened face to the small, crying bundle clutched protectively against her chest. "I came the moment I learned what Edgar intended. I did not know, Eleanor. I did not know about our son, and I did not know the letter that drove you from my house was a forgery until far too late to prevent this." Fletcher, seeing the situation collapsing entirely around him and understanding immediately that continuing his assigned task in the presence of the Duke himself would end only in his own ruin, raised both hands in surrender and backed slowly away from Eleanor toward the door. "I was paid only to remove her from London, Your Grace. Nothing more sinister than that. Mr. Voss assured me no harm would come to either of them, only distance." "Edgar sent you," Julian said, the confirmation of his cousin's guilt settling over him with a grim finality that erased any last shred of doubt he might have carried into this desperate night. "You will repeat that confession to the magistrate, and you will name every detail of what my cousin has done, or you will face the full weight of the law entirely alone, while he escapes any consequence whatsoever." Fletcher, already regretting his involvement in a scheme that had grown far beyond his original comfortable understanding of the task, nodded quickly, eager now to distance himself from Edgar's plotting in whatever way might preserve his own freedom. The two hired men outside offered similarly little resistance once the magistrate's constables arrived, summoned by Charlotte's earlier warning, and within a quarter hour the immediate danger had passed entirely, leaving only the shattered remains of Edgar's desperate final gambit scattered across Margaret's small shop. Julian remained where he stood, unwilling to close the distance between himself and Eleanor too quickly, uncertain of what welcome, if any, he still deserved after everything he had done. "May I see him?" he asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the small, tear-streaked face now beginning to calm against Eleanor's shoulder. "My son. May I see my son?" Eleanor hesitated, months of pain and abandonment warring against the evident sincerity of the man standing before her, a man who had, after all, arrived in time to prevent a terrible fate for both her and Henry, whatever his earlier failures had cost them both. Slowly, cautiously, she loosened her protective grip enough to allow Julian to step closer, close enough to look properly upon the son he had never known existed until this very night. Julian's breath caught at the sight of Henry's small face, the dark hair so clearly inherited from his own family line, the shape of his chin that mirrored Julian's own reflection in countless mirrors throughout his life. Tears he had not shed since childhood gathered unexpectedly in his eyes, grief and joy and shame all tangled together into an emotion he could not easily name. "I am so sorry," Julian said, his voice breaking entirely, all pretense of ducal composure abandoned in the face of everything he now understood about his own terrible mistake. "I am so profoundly sorry, Eleanor, for every moment of suffering my blindness has caused you both. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I beg you to allow me the chance to earn it, however long that might require." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, exhaustion and relief and lingering anger all warring within her in equal measure, before finally allowing herself to speak the words that had waited, unspoken, for nearly a year. "You believed a lie over your own wife's word, Julian. You cast me into the street with nothing, carrying your child, and left me to build a life from nothing, while you remained comfortable in your certainty. That is not a wound easily healed by a single night's rescue. However grateful I am for your arrival tonight." "I know," Julian said quietly. "I know it is not enough, and I do not expect it to be. But let me begin, tonight, to try. Let me help you and our son properly, openly, as you both deserve, and let me spend whatever years remain to me, proving that tonight marks a true beginning, rather than merely an ending to danger." Margaret, watching the exchange from the doorway with Charlotte Fenwick beside her, exchanged a knowing glance with the inquiry agent, both women recognizing that whatever came next between Eleanor and Julian would require far more than a single dramatic rescue to fully mend, but that a foundation, however fragile, had at least been laid for something better than the cruel injustice that had defined the past year of their lives. Edgar Voss learned of Fletcher's failure within hours, word reaching him through a frightened messenger before the sun had fully risen the following morning. The magistrate's constables had taken Fletcher and his two hired men into custody, and Fletcher, true to his word, had already begun naming Edgar as the architect of the entire scheme, trading his own limited freedom for whatever leniency his cooperation might earn him. Edgar understood immediately that his carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely, that no amount of clever explanation or hasty denial could undo the damage of Fletcher's confession, combined with whatever evidence Julian's private investigation had already uncovered. He considered, briefly and desperately, fleeing London entirely, disappearing to the continent where English law might struggle to reach him, but pride, or perhaps simple exhaustion after a year of constant careful scheming, kept him rooted at his lodgings, awaiting whatever consequence approached with a strange, hollow calm. Julian arrived that same morning, having spent what remained of the previous night ensuring Eleanor and Henry were settled safely under Charlotte Fenwick's protection at a respectable inn, while he attended to the urgent matter of confronting his cousin directly. He entered Edgar's lodgings without waiting for an invitation, finding his cousin seated at his writing desk, the very desk, Julian suspected, where the forged letter that destroyed his marriage had first been crafted. "You have nothing to say for yourself?" Julian asked, his voice carrying a controlled fury far more unsettling than open rage might have been. Edgar looked up slowly, something almost like relief crossing his features, the exhausting weight of a year's deception finally lifted by the simple, terrible fact of discovery. "What would you have me say, Julian? That I envied you your title and your fortune, your easy inheritance of everything I was born too late and too distant to claim for myself, that I convinced myself, over months of careful planning, that I deserved what should rightfully have passed to me, had circumstances of birth favored me even slightly differently?" "You destroyed an innocent woman's life," Julian said, stepping closer to the desk, his hands clenched at his sides against the urge toward violence that his cousin's calm confession stirred within him. "You forged a letter that convinced me to cast out my own wife, carrying my child, and left her to survive in poverty, while you consolidated your position within my own household. And when even that cruelty proved insufficient to protect your scheme, you arranged to have her and our son taken from London entirely, against their will, by force if necessary." "I never intended real harm to come to either of them," Edgar said, though even he seemed to recognize the hollow inadequacy of the defense as the words left his mouth. "I told myself, throughout everything, that I sought only distance, only delay, never true violence against a woman or a child." "And yet you hired men willing to break into a woman's home in the dead of night to forcibly remove her and an infant from the only shelter they had," Julian said. "Whatever comfortable fiction you told yourself, Edgar, the truth of your actions speaks far louder than your excuses." Edgar had no answer for this, sitting in silence for a long moment before finally rising from his desk, his posture carrying a resignation that suggested he understood, at last, that no further scheming or clever explanation could rescue him from the consequences now closing in around him from every direction. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "The magistrate already holds Fletcher's confession," Julian said. "You will answer for forgery, for the abduction attempt, and for every lie you have told me over this past year to protect your scheme. I will not intervene to soften whatever judgment the law decides you deserve, though I will ensure the proceedings remain as private as such a serious matter allows, if only to spare our family name further scandal beyond what your actions have already guaranteed." Edgar nodded slowly, offering no further resistance as Julian summoned the constables waiting outside to take his cousin into formal custody. The scandal, when it finally broke across London society in the following weeks, proved considerably smaller than Edgar's worst fears had anticipated. Julian's careful management of the proceedings ensuring that most of society learned only that a distant cousin had been found guilty of financial forgery and fraud against the estate, a scandalous but hardly unprecedented crime among the aristocracy's more distant and desperate relations. The full truth of Eleanor's expulsion and Henry's existence remained, for now, a private matter known only to those directly involved and those Julian trusted absolutely. With Edgar's scheme fully exposed and its architect facing the consequences of his deception, Julian turned his full attention toward the far more delicate task of repairing what remained possible between himself and Eleanor. He visited her daily at the inn where she and Henry remained under Charlotte's watchful protection, bringing gifts for their son that Eleanor initially accepted with reserved caution, unwilling to allow herself full trust in a man who had so completely failed her once already, however genuine his current remorse appeared. "I do not ask you to forget what happened," Julian said during one such visit, watching Eleanor feed Henry while he sat at a respectful distance, careful not to press for more intimacy than she currently offered him. "I only ask for the opportunity to show you, through actions rather than mere words, that I have learned from my terrible mistake. and that I intend to spend whatever years remain to me, proving myself worthy of the trust I so carelessly threw away. Eleanor considered his words carefully, watching Henry's small hands grip her finger with the same fierce determination she had come to recognize as belonging entirely to his father's character, despite his infant age. "You hurt me deeply, Julian. Deeper than I believe you fully understand, even now. I built an entire life without you, out of necessity, and I discovered strength within myself I did not know existed before that terrible night. I would never ask you to abandon that strength," Julian said earnestly. "If anything, I admire it more than I can properly express. You survived circumstances that would have broken many people, and you raised our son with a devotion I can only hope to eventually match. I do not wish to erase the woman you have become through this ordeal. I only wish for the chance to stand beside her, if she will eventually allow it, rather than remaining forever separated by my own past failures." Weeks passed in this careful, patient rebuilding of trust, Julian proving his sincerity through consistent action rather than empty promises, ensuring Eleanor and Henry wanted for nothing while never pressing her toward a reconciliation she was not yet ready to fully embrace. Margaret remained a constant presence throughout this period as well, Eleanor unwilling to abandon the woman who had shown her such profound kindness during her darkest months, and Julian, to his credit, welcomed the seamstress's continued involvement in their lives with genuine gratitude, rather than the dismissive condescension Eleanor might once have feared from a man of his position. It was Margaret, in fact, who eventually helped Eleanor recognize the difference between the frightened, desperate man who had cast her out in a moment of manipulated fury, and the patient, humbled man who now worked so consistently to earn back what he had lost. "I have watched many men in my years," Margaret told her one evening, as they sat together in the comfortable parlor Julian had arranged for their temporary lodging. "Most who claim remorse abandon that claim the moment it becomes inconvenient. This one has not wavered once in these past weeks. Not when it would have been easier to simply move forward without your forgiveness. Not when the scandal surrounding his cousin might have offered him easy excuse to withdraw from difficult obligations. I believe his remorse runs genuine, Eleanor, whatever judgment you ultimately choose to make of it." Eleanor took Margaret's counsel seriously, recognizing the wisdom earned through the older woman's own years of hard-won experience, and slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to consider a future that might include Julian after all, not the naive, trusting future she had once imagined during their brief months of secret marriage, but something more grounded, more honestly negotiated between two people who now understood, with painful clarity, exactly how much damage carelessness and unchecked anger could inflict upon those meant to be loved and protected above all others. The reconciliation, when it finally came, arrived not through grand gesture but through quiet, accumulated trust, Eleanor gradually allowing Julian greater presence in her daily life and Henry's care, until one evening, several months after the terrible night of the attempted abduction, she agreed to return to Kensworth House, not as a secret wife hidden away from society's judgment, but as Julian's acknowledged duchess, prepared finally to take her rightful place beside him openly. Julian insisted on a public presentation worthy of the wrong he had committed against her, a grand reception at Kensworth House to which he invited the full breadth of London society, including many who had, over the past year, quietly whispered rumors about the mysterious absence of the Duke's supposed wife, rumors Edgar had, in fact, deliberately encouraged during his time consolidating control over the household's affairs. Eleanor stood beside Julian at the top of the grand staircase as their guests arrived, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that Margaret herself had helped design and stitch, a final testament to the skill Eleanor had built during her months of independent survival. Henry, now nearly a year old and beginning to take his first unsteady steps, remained with a trusted nurse in the nursery upstairs, though Julian had made clear to every guest present that his son's existence would soon be formally acknowledged and celebrated in due course, once London society had properly absorbed the scandal of Edgar's exposed treachery and the truth of Eleanor's complete innocence. "My wife," Julian announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the grand hall, pride and love evident in every word, "was cruelly wronged by a scheme of forgery and deception, orchestrated by my own cousin, a man who has since answered fully for his crimes before the law. I ask each of you to extend to her the respect and honor she has always deserved, and which I failed, for too long, to properly protect." The assembled guests, whatever private judgments they might have carried into the evening, responded with genuine warmth to Julian's public declaration, understanding immediately the political and social wisdom of accepting his account without question, whatever curiosity remained about the finer details of the scandal. Eleanor felt, for the first time since that terrible night in the hallway nearly a year before, a sense of true vindication settling over her, the public acknowledgement she had once feared she would never receive finally arriving in full measure before the very society that had once, through no fault of her own, excluded her entirely. In the months that followed, Julian formally acknowledged Henry as his son and heir, ensuring the boy's future inheritance stood beyond any possible legal challenge, and slowly, carefully, he and Eleanor rebuilt the foundation of trust that Edgar's scheming had so thoroughly shattered. Their marriage, when it finally settled into its true and lasting form, carried a depth of honesty and hard-won understanding that their earlier, more naive devotion had never quite achieved, tempered as it now was by genuine knowledge of exactly what each was capable of surviving, and exactly what both were willing to sacrifice to protect the family they had, against every obstacle placed before them, finally managed to reclaim. Margaret remained a beloved presence in their lives for many years afterward, welcomed at Kensworth House as an honored friend rather than a mere acquaintance from Eleanor's difficult past. And Henry grew up knowing the full story of his mother's courage and resilience during the months before his birth. A story that would, in later years, become a treasured part of the family's history, rather than a source of shame to be hidden or forgotten. Eleanor never forgot the lessons learned during her year of hardship and independence, carrying forward into her role as Duchess a strength and self-reliance that many in London society came, over time, to quietly admire, even as they marveled at the dramatic story of her expulsion and eventual triumphant return. She had survived what many women in her position might not have, had built something lasting from the ruins of her broken trust, and had emerged, in the end, not merely restored to her former position, but transformed into a woman far stronger and far more certain of her own worth than the naive, trusting bride who had once walked into Julian Ashford's grand and secretive marriage so many months before. The trial of Edgar Voss, conducted with as much discretion as English law permitted for a matter involving forgery and attempted abduction, concluded with a sentence of many years' imprisonment, a fate that effectively ended any hope he had once harbored of inheriting the Ashford title or fortune under any circumstance. Julian visited him only once, before the sentencing, not out of any lingering affection for his cousin, but out of a determination to understand, as fully as possible, the depth of the deception that had so nearly destroyed everything he cherished most. "Do you regret it?" Julian asked, standing on the opposite side of the small room where Edgar awaited his final judgment. Edgar considered the question for a long moment before answering with something that resembled genuine honesty, perhaps for the first time in their entire conversation. "I regret being discovered. I regret the harm that came to a woman and child who never wronged me in any way. Whether I regret the ambition itself, the desire for something I believed I deserved and was denied only by accident of birth, I cannot honestly say even now. Perhaps that admission alone tells you everything you need to know about the man I allowed myself to become." Julian left the meeting with no satisfaction, only a lingering sadness for the cousin he had once trusted completely, a man whose bitterness and ambition had ultimately consumed every better quality he might once have possessed. He resolved in the aftermath to be more watchful of his own household in the future, more careful to verify claims before acting upon them, a lesson learned at tremendous cost that he vowed never to forget for the remainder of his life. As the years passed, Kensworth House transformed from the site of Eleanor's greatest sorrow into the setting for a genuinely happy family life. Henry grew into a curious, energetic boy who showed early promise in his studies and an affectionate nature that endeared him to every member of the household staff, many of whom remembered clearly the difficult circumstances surrounding his birth and took quiet pride in watching him flourish under his parents' devoted care. Eleanor and Julian welcomed a daughter 2 years after their public reconciliation, a sister for Henry whom they named Grace, in honor of the mercy and forgiveness that had ultimately restored their family against every obstacle placed in their path. Margaret's small shop near the river continued to thrive as well, bolstered by the patronage of Eleanor's new connections among London's aristocracy, women who sought out the seamstress whose skill had once helped a duchess survive her darkest hour, and who now found genuine pride in providing fine work for the very household that had once seemed impossibly distant from her humble establishment. Margaret never fully retired, insisting that her hands required useful work until her final years, though she spent increasing time at Kensworth House as an honored guest, watching Henry and later Grace grow with the same devoted affection she had shown Eleanor from their very first meeting on a cold London doorstep. Peter Lowell, whose quiet courage in sharing his fragmented memories had set Julian's investigation onto its true and eventually successful path, received a position of greater trust and responsibility within the household, a reward Julian insisted upon despite the young man's modest protests that he had done nothing more than speak an honest truth when it mattered most. Charlotte Fenwick, too, remained a valued acquaintance of the family for years afterward, occasionally called upon for her particular skills whenever some delicate matter required her discreet investigation. Eleanor often thought back, in quiet moments during her comfortable and settled life, to that terrible night when Julian's angry words had cast her out into an uncertain darkness, carrying nothing but a small parcel of bread and the child growing silently within her. She had believed, in her lowest moments during those difficult early weeks, that her life had been irreparably broken, that nothing good could possibly emerge from such profound betrayal and loss. Yet looking now at her husband, humbled and devoted in equal measure, at her son growing tall and strong beside his younger sister, at the enduring friendship of a seamstress who had offered shelter to a stranger without asking anything in return, Eleanor understood that even the darkest nights sometimes gave way, eventually, to a dawn far brighter and more genuine than anything she could have imagined during her hours of deepest despair. 10 years after the night Julian Ashford ordered his young wife from his house, a carriage bearing the Ashford crest rolled through the gates of a modest countryside estate that had once belonged to Eleanor's aunt, the very relation whose worried inquiries had helped set Julian's investigation into motion so long ago. The aunt, now elderly and increasingly frail, had asked to see her niece one final time, and Eleanor traveled the distance with Henry, now a tall and thoughtful boy of 11, eager to know more of his mother's family history before it faded entirely from living memory. The visit proved bittersweet, filled with stories Eleanor had never heard about her own mother's girlhood, tales that connected Henry to a lineage stretching back generations before his birth had ever complicated the neat lines of inheritance and title that once seemed to define his worth in the eyes of London society. Henry listened with rapt attention, asking questions about relatives long since passed, delighting in discovering that his fierce determination, so often remarked upon by the household staff at Kensworth House, had apparently been inherited directly from his great-grandmother, a woman known throughout her own generation for refusing to accept defeat in any circumstance. "You come from strong people on both sides, my darling," Eleanor told him during their journey home, watching the countryside roll past the carriage window. "Your father's family and mine both, though the path that brought us all together was far more difficult than most children ever need to know." Henry, old enough now to understand fragments of the story that had shaped his early life, though Eleanor and Julian had carefully protected him from the harsher details until he grew mature enough to hear them properly, nodded thoughtfully. "Grandmother Bramwell told me once that you were the bravest woman she had ever known. She said you survived things that would have broken most people, and that I should be proud to carry your strength within me." Eleanor smiled at the memory of Mrs. Bramwell, who had remained at Kensworth House for many years after Eleanor's return, growing into something like a grandmother figure for both Henry and Grace, sharing stories with the children that Eleanor herself sometimes found too painful to recount in full detail. "Mrs. Bramwell always did have a gift for finding the right words," Eleanor said. "I hope, someday, you will understand that true strength is not about avoiding difficulty entirely, but about finding a way forward, even when every path seems closed to you." Back at Kensworth House, Julian had spent the years since his reconciliation with Eleanor working diligently to repair not only his own marriage but the broader damage Edgar's scheme had inflicted upon the estate's finances and reputation. He established, with Eleanor's enthusiastic support, a small charitable foundation dedicated to assisting women who found themselves abandoned or cast out under circumstances similar to what Eleanor herself had once endured. A project that grew, over the following years, into one of London's more respected institutions for aiding vulnerable mothers and their children. Eleanor took an active role in the foundation's work, often visiting the modest houses it maintained across London to speak personally with women, navigating hardships she understood far more intimately than most duchesses of her position ever could. She never spoke publicly of her own history in detail, preferring to let her genuine empathy and practical assistance speak louder than any dramatic retelling of her past sorrows, though the women she helped often sensed, correctly, that her kindness sprang from something deeper than mere aristocratic charity. "You understand what it feels like," one young woman told her during a visit to the foundation's primary house, a widow struggling to provide for two small children after her husband's sudden death left her with nothing but debts and an uncertain future. "Most fine ladies who visit here speak to us as though we are charity cases to be pitied. You speak to us as though we are simply people who have faced difficult circumstances, the same as anyone might." "Because I have faced them myself," Eleanor said simply. "Though my own story ended more fortunately than many, I do not forget how frightening it feels to face an uncertain future with a child depending entirely upon your strength and resourcefulness." Grace, now approaching her 9th year, had grown into a bright and curious girl who showed less interest in her brother's fascination with family history and more enthusiasm for the practical work of Eleanor's foundation, often accompanying her mother on visits and asking pointed, thoughtful questions about how the houses were funded and managed. Julian, watching his daughter's growing engagement with matters most young ladies of her station never considered, found himself filled with quiet pride at the independence and compassion both his children had inherited from their remarkable mother. The relationship between Julian and Eleanor, tested so severely in the early months of their marriage, had settled over the years into something far deeper and more resilient than the naive devotion of their earliest days together. They had learned, through painful experience, the importance of open communication, of questioning assumptions before acting upon them, of extending trust carefully but genuinely once it had been properly earned. Julian never again allowed a single unverified accusation to shake his faith in his wife. And Eleanor, though the scars of her earlier abandonment never fully faded, found herself able to trust him completely once more, understanding that the man who had failed her so terribly had also proven himself willing to spend a lifetime making genuine amends. Margaret Hale passed peacefully in her sleep during the 11th year after Eleanor's return to Kensworth House, surrounded by the family she had chosen as her own during those difficult early months when Eleanor had needed shelter and kindness above all else. Eleanor grieved deeply for the woman who had shown her such profound generosity when she possessed nothing to offer in return, and she ensured, in the years that followed, that Margaret's shop near the river continued operating under new ownership, staffed by women trained through Eleanor's foundation, a living tribute to the kindness that had once saved both Eleanor and her infant son from utter desperation. Peter Lowell, having risen steadily through positions of increasing responsibility within the Ashford household over the years, eventually married one of the young women Eleanor's foundation had assisted, a union that brought quiet satisfaction to Eleanor, who had watched the shy young footman grow into a confident and respected steward over the course of their long acquaintance. Julian stood as witness at their wedding, a gesture of gratitude toward the man whose small act of courage had ultimately saved his entire family from a fate far darker than the one they had actually endured. Edgar Voss remained imprisoned for the duration of his sentence, and upon his eventual release, chose to leave England entirely, rather than face the lingering shadow of his exposed crimes, among a society that had never fully forgotten, despite Julian's careful management of the initial scandal, the true nature of his betrayal. Julian received occasional word of his cousin's whereabouts over the following years, reports of a quiet, solitary life maintained far from London's judgment, and though he felt no desire to renew any relationship with the man who had so thoroughly betrayed his trust, he found, with the passage of time, that his anger had gradually softened into something closer to distant, weary pity for a man whose ambition had cost him everything he might otherwise have possessed. On the 10th anniversary of Eleanor's public presentation as Julian's Duchess, the family gathered at Kensworth House for a quiet celebration, far removed from the grand society reception that had marked her original return. Henry, tall and thoughtful, sat beside his father discussing the management of the estate he would one day inherit. Questions and observations that revealed a maturity beyond his years, shaped in no small part by the honest, difficult history his parents had never fully hidden from him once he grew old enough to understand it properly. Grace, seated beside her mother, chattered enthusiastically about the foundation's newest project, a school established to teach practical skills to the children of the women Eleanor's charity assisted. Eleanor looked around the table at her family, at the life she had built from the wreckage of that terrible night so many years before, and felt a gratitude too deep for easy expression. She had walked out of Kensworth House with nothing but a small parcel of bread and an uncertain future, carrying within her a child whose very existence had once been dismissed as a convenient lie. She had built, through her own strength and the kindness of strangers who became lifelong friends, a foundation sturdy enough to weather even the darkest betrayal, and she had watched that foundation grow, over the years, into a family and a legacy far richer than anything the frightened, heartbroken young woman on that London street could have possibly imagined for herself. "What are you thinking of?" Julian asked quietly, noticing the distant expression on her face as their children's conversation continued around them. Eleanor smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand in hers, a simple gesture that carried within it the accumulated trust and understanding of a decade's careful rebuilding. "I am thinking that even the darkest nights eventually end," she said, "and that I would not trade the strength I found during mine for any easier path that might have avoided it entirely. We built something real from the ruins of that terrible mistake, Julian. Something I believe will endure far longer than the sorrow that once threatened to destroy it completely." Later that evening, After the children had gone to bed, and the household had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Julian and Eleanor walked together through the gardens where they had once shared quiet conversations during the earliest days of their courtship, long before secrecy and forged letters had ever threatened to tear their happiness apart. The gardens had changed little over the years, the same roses climbing the same stone walls, though both of them had changed considerably since those innocent early days, tempered by hardship into people far more aware of how easily happiness could be lost, and how deliberately it needed to be protected once regained. "Do you ever wonder," Eleanor asked, pausing beside the fountain where Julian had first told her he loved her, so many years before, what our lives might have been, had Edgar never crafted that letter? Had none of this ever happened to us at all? Julian considered the question seriously, watching moonlight ripple across the fountain's still water. "I have wondered, certainly, in weaker moments, but I find, when I examine the question honestly, that I would not wish away the years of hardship entirely, difficult as that admission feels. They shaped you into the woman standing beside me now, a woman I admire as much as I love, and they shaped our children into people who understand, from an early age, that comfort and privilege carry responsibility toward those less fortunate. I cannot wish away suffering that ultimately produced so much genuine good, even as I regret every moment of pain it caused you." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding the complicated truth within his words, a truth she had arrived at herself during her quieter moments of reflection over the years. "I feel the same, though I did not always believe I would. There were nights, during those first terrible months, when I could not imagine any future worth surviving toward. Now I look at what we built from that darkness, and I find myself grateful, however strange that gratitude might seem, for the woman I became through enduring it." They stood together beside the fountain a while longer, two people who had weathered betrayal and separation and had emerged, through patience and genuine effort, into a partnership built on far sturdier foundations than the naive devotion of their youth had ever provided. Above them, the same London sky that had once witnessed Eleanor's desperate flight into the cold night now stretched calm and star-filled over a family finally, fully restored, their hard-won happiness a quiet testament to the truth that even the deepest betrayals could, with courage and honesty and enough stubborn hope, eventually give way to something lasting and genuinely good.